The humidity was suffocating, the kind that wraps around your chest and makes every breath feel like drowning in warm water. Colonel Keanu Ikiki stood motionless at the edge of a coconut grove, sweat soaking through his uniform, his eyes fixed on the shallow creek ahead. Beyond that dark water lay the American positions. Beyond that lay everything he had been waiting for. It was just past 6 in the morning on August 21st, 1942. The sun had barely touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood orange above the jungles of Guadalcanal. Behind Ikiki stood 917 of the finest soldiers the Japanese Empire had ever produced, men hardened by years of relentless training, men who had swept across Asia like a tidal wave, crushing every enemy in their path, men who had never known defeat. Ikiki had studied the intelligence reports on the American Marines waiting across that creek. He knew exactly what kind of enemy he was about to face. Soft men, undisciplined men, products of a weak, materialistic culture that valued personal comfort over sacrifice. Men who would scatter like leaves in a typhoon the moment Japanese steel came for them. Here is the question that would haunt Japanese commanders for the rest of the war. What happens when everything you believe about your enemy turns out to be catastrophically, fatally wrong? In roughly 6 hours, 800 of Ikiki's soldiers would lie dead. The sandbar they were about to cross would be carpeted with Japanese corpses. And the foundational belief that had guided Japanese military strategy for decades, the unshakable conviction that American fighting men lacked the spirit to stand against the warriors of Japan, would begin its violent collapse. This is the story of how a jungle-covered island in the Solomon Islands became the graveyard of an empire's most dangerous assumption. But before we reach that creek, before the screaming and the gunfire and the blood, you need to understand something crucial. You need to understand why Ikiki was so confident. Why he genuinely believed with every fiber of his being that the men waiting in those foxholes across the water would break and run. Because his confidence was not arrogance born from ignorance. It was the product of decades of military doctrine, centuries of cultural belief, and months of battlefield evidence that seemed to prove everything Japan had ever believed about Western soldiers. Let me take you back. The sun goddess Amaterasu, according to ancient Japanese texts, gave birth to a divine bloodline that would rule the islands of Japan for eternity. The emperor himself was not merely a political leader. He was a living god, a direct descendant of heaven walking the earth. Japanese soldiers did not simply fight for their country. They fought for something far more profound. They fought for a sacred heritage stretching back thousands of years into mythology itself. From this belief grew a concept that shaped everything about how Japan approached warfare. They called it Yamato Damasha, the spirit of Japan. This was not mere nationalism or patriotism. It was an absolute conviction that Japanese soldiers possessed a spiritual superiority that transcended physical reality. Where Western nations relied on machines, factories, and raw industrial power, Japan relied on something they believed was far more powerful. The indomitable will of warriors willing to die for their emperor without hesitation, without regret, without fear. Think about that for a moment. Imagine building your entire military strategy around the belief that your soldiers are spiritually superior to any enemy they might face. That determination and willingness to die will always overcome technology and firepower. That the enemy, no matter how well equipped, will always break first because they simply do not possess the warrior soul that defines your people. And here is the thing that made this belief so dangerous. For decades, it appeared to be true. In 1905, Japan stunned the world by defeating Russia in a war that should have been impossible. A smaller Asian nation had humiliated a European power with modern weapons and industrial backing. Russian armies had crumbled against Japanese soldiers who demonstrated an almost supernatural willingness to sacrifice themselves. The lesson seemed obvious. Spirit could triumph over steel. Will could defeat weapons. Material strength meant nothing against men ready to give everything for victory. The Russo-Japanese War became a template, a proof of concept for how Japan would approach all future conflicts. And when the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, everything seemed to confirm what Japanese commanders had always believed. The Philippines fell in weeks. Positions that were supposed to hold for months collapsed in days. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers surrendered in one of the worst military disasters in United States history. Singapore, which Winston Churchill himself called the greatest British military catastrophe ever, saw over 80,000 Allied troops surrender to a Japanese force half their size. The supposedly impregnable fortress had been conquered in a matter of weeks. Across the Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong, Burma, and beyond, the pattern repeated with terrifying consistency. Western forces simply could not match Japanese determination. Colonial armies that had maintained order for generations crumbled when faced with soldiers who seemed to welcome death. So when Japanese intelligence assessed the United States Marine Corps, they found nothing to worry about. A small force, poorly equipped compared to the army, with no significant combat experience since the First World War. They had spent the years between wars fighting small, forgotten conflicts in Central America and the Caribbean. The battles of Nicaragua and Haiti were hardly the stuff of legend. Japanese planners saw garrison troops playing at being soldiers, not a force that would pose any real challenge. What they missed would cost them everything. While Japanese planners were dismissing the Marines as inconsequential, those same Marines were undergoing a quiet transformation. Officers had developed revolutionary new doctrines for amphibious warfare, recognizing that any Pacific war would require the ability to assault fortified beaches against determined opposition. They had created specialized equipment. They had designed training programs unlike anything the military had seen before. Most importantly, they had built a culture that emphasized something the rigid Japanese command structure could not understand: individual initiative, small unit leadership, and the ability of junior Marines to keep fighting even when plans fell apart and communications went dark. But Ikiki knew none of this as he stared across that creek on the morning of August 21st. Here is what he knew. American Marines had landed on Guadalcanal 2 weeks earlier and seized an airfield the Japanese had been building on the island. They needed to be pushed back into the sea. Simple. His orders told him to wait for reinforcements for the rest of his regiment arriving on slower ships. He saw no reason to wait. 900 men against soft Americans. What more could possibly be required? 11,000 Marines were dug in around that airfield. Ikiki had no idea. Major General Alexander Vandegrift had no time to worry about what the Japanese thought of his Marines. He was too busy trying to keep them alive. Vandegrift was 54 years old, a veteran of campaigns in Nicaragua, Haiti, and China who had spent his entire adult life in the Marine Corps. He knew what his men could do. He also knew they had never faced anything remotely like what awaited them in the Solomon Islands. He had been promised 6 months to train his division before comp. He got 3 weeks when Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal, was suddenly announced. 3 weeks. His men were scattered across the Pacific. Equipment was still being unloaded in New Zealand. There was no time for proper planning. Intelligence on Japanese defenses was practically non-existent. The rehearsal landing in the Fiji Islands was so disastrous that one officer remarked that experienced planners would have pronounced the entire Guadalcanal operation impossible. The division itself was a mixture of hardened veterans and raw recruits. Many had enlisted in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, motivated by rage at the Japanese attack. They had minimal training, zero combat experience. They did not understand jungle warfare. They did not know about the diseases waiting for them. They had never faced an enemy who would rather die than surrender. On August 7, 1942, 11,000 of these men stormed ashore on Guadalcanal and the nearby islands of Chalagi and Gavutu Tanambogo. They achieved complete surprise. Japanese construction workers and a small Korean labor garrison fled into the jungle when American warships opened fire. By nightfall on August 8th, the Marines had secured Henderson Field, the unfinished airstrip named for a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. The landing had been easier than anyone expected, but taking Guadalcanal was about to prove far simpler than holding it. Then everything fell apart. On the night of August 8th, a Japanese naval force surprised and annihilated the Allied cruiser screen at the Battle of Savo Island. 4 cruisers sunk, over 1,000 sailors dead. One of the worst naval defeats in American history, accomplished in less than an hour of furious nighttime combat. The naval commander, fearing further losses to his irreplaceable aircraft carriers, withdrew the fleet. With it went most of the Marine supplies and equipment that had not yet been unloaded. The Marines watched their ships sail away and felt something cold settle in their stomachs. They were being abandoned. Decades later, veterans would still speak of that withdrawal with bitter anger. One commemorative medal privately minted after the campaign showed a hand in an admiral's sleeve dropping a hot potato into the arms of a Marine with a Latin inscription that translates to "Let George do it." Vandegrift's Marines were stranded on an island, surrounded by enemy-controlled seas with half their supplies, limited ammunition, no naval support, and no reinforcements coming. They had captured their objective. Now they had to hold it against an enemy already moving to take it back. They dug in around Henderson Field. They finished the airstrip using captured Japanese equipment. They salvaged what they could find. They ate captured Japanese rice when their own food ran out. They waited for the counterattack they knew was coming. The jungle around them was hostile in ways none of them had imagined. Heat so oppressive it felt like a physical weight. Humidity that soaked through everything and never let anything dry. Mosquitoes carrying malaria that swarmed in clouds thick enough to breathe. Within weeks, disease would disable more Marines than Japanese bullets. But they held their positions. They kept working. They waited. On August 20th, the first American aircraft touched down at Henderson Field. The Cactus Air Force, as it would become known, would prove essential to survival. But those planes were not yet ready when the first Japanese counterattack arrived. Ikiki landed at Teivu Point on the night of August 19th with his 917 men. Japanese aerial reconnaissance had reported few visible American troops and no large ships nearby. A staff officer had personally flown over the Marine positions and seen almost nothing, concluding that the Americans had withdrawn most of their forces. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong, but even if Ikiki had known the truth, it might not have changed anything. He had absolute faith in the superiority of his soldiers. His regiment was no ordinary unit. The 28th Infantry Regiment had originally been designated to assault Midway Island. When the naval battle ended that possibility, they were redirected to Guadalcanal. These men had trained for the most difficult kind of operation, a contested amphibious landing against fortified positions. They were among the best Japan had. Ikiki left a small rear guard and immediately began marching toward Henderson Field. His orders had been to wait for the rest of his regiment. He ignored them. The Marines would collapse at the first assault. Why share the glory? What Ikiki did not know was that the Marines were aware he was coming. A coast watcher named Jacob Vuza had been captured by Japanese soldiers while gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. Vuza was a former sergeant major in the British Solomon Islands police force, a local man who had volunteered to help the Americans. The Japanese found an American flag hidden in his clothing. They demanded information about Marine positions. Vuza refused to talk. They tied him to a tree and used him for bayonet practice. 7 times they stabbed him. In his arms, his throat, his shoulder, his face, his chest, his stomach. They left him there to die. He was not dead. After the Japanese moved on, Vuza chewed through his ropes. He crawled through the jungle for miles, bleeding from wounds that should have been fatal. He reached the Marine lines and gasped out a warning about the approaching attack just minutes before Ikiki's assault began. Vuza would survive. He would continue to serve alongside the Marines throughout the campaign. He would receive the Silver Star and be made an honorary sergeant major in the Marine Corps. But that night, bleeding and barely conscious, he gave the Marines something priceless. He gave them time to prepare. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on August 21st, Ikiki launched his assault across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek. The Marines were waiting. Picture this moment. The darkness is almost absolute. The only sounds are jungle insects and the gentle gurgle of the creek. Then, from across the water, screaming. The word bands echoing through the night, shapes emerging from the darkness, bayonets fixed, charging forward with the absolute certainty that the Americans will flee. This was how it had always worked. This was the pattern that had repeated across Asia. Western troops faced with a determined Japanese night assault would panic. Their nerve would shatter. They would run. What happened instead shocked every Japanese soldier who survived to tell of it. The Marines did not run. Machine gun positions along the creek opened up with devastating accuracy. Water-cooled .30 caliber guns manned by Marines who had trained relentlessly with those weapons cut through the assault waves like scythes through wheat. The water ran red. Bodies piled on the sandbar. Japanese soldiers fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Artillery batteries that had registered their targets before nightfall dropped shells directly onto the assault formations. The accuracy stunned Japanese officers. Every approach route seemed covered. Every advance was met with coordinated fire that shredded their formations before they could mass for breakthrough. And when Japanese soldiers managed to close with the Marine lines, they found something they had never encountered before. Americans who fought back with equal ferocity. Marines using rifles, pistols, bayonets, and bare hands. Men who gave ground grudgingly, then counterattacked to retake lost positions. Men who showed no fear and asked for no mercy. One machine gunner, Private Al Schmid, was wounded early in the fighting when a grenade exploded near his position. Shrapnel destroyed both his eyes. Blinded, he continued operating his weapon by touch alone, guided by his assistant gunner who directed his fire toward the sounds of approaching Japanese. He remained at his post until dawn. By sunrise, the assault had failed completely. Ikiki's men had achieved nothing except their own destruction. But the battle was not over. As the sun rose over Guadalcanal, Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. Marines from the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines crossed the creek upstream and swung around to encircle the surviving Japanese in a coconut grove. Light tanks joined the assault, M3 Stuarts that the Marines called their Iron Cavalry. The encirclement was methodical. Japanese soldiers who had survived the night found themselves trapped with Marines closing from every direction. Some tried to swim to safety and were shot in the water. Some fought to the last bullet and then charged with bayonets. Some committed suicide rather than face capture. The tanks rolled through the grove, machine guns hammering, treads crushing wounded Japanese soldiers beneath them. The Marines who followed showed no more mercy than the Japanese had shown in their own conquests. The reality was brutal. The Marines had absorbed the shock of Japanese tactics and answered with overwhelming violence. One Marine who participated later described the aftermath. Bodies lay in clusters and heaps before the gun positions, as though the men had died in groups rather than one by one. Moving among them were souvenir hunters, picking their way carefully, fearful of booby traps. By late afternoon on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of Ikeki's original 917 men, approximately 800 were dead. The survivors, perhaps 128, escaped into the jungle. Marine casualties were 35 killed and 75 wounded. For every American who fell, more than 7 Japanese soldiers died. This was not supposed to happen. This was not what decades of military doctrine had predicted. Colonel Ikeki burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture, a profound disgrace in Japanese military culture. He then either died fighting in the final stages of the battle or committed ritual suicide shortly thereafter. The exact circumstances remain uncertain. What is certain is that he did not survive to explain why his assault had failed so catastrophically. Now here is where you might expect Japanese commanders to pause, to reassess, to ask themselves whether their assumptions about American fighting capability might be wrong. That is not what happened. When news of the Ikeki detachment's destruction reached Rabaul, Japanese commanders reacted with disbelief. The reports had to be wrong. A Japanese infantry regiment could not have been annihilated by American Marines. This was simply not possible. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had the same reaction. The defeat was so unexpected, so contrary to everything they believed, that many officers refused to accept it. Something must have gone wrong with Ikeki's plan. Perhaps he had attacked the wrong position. Perhaps the reports exaggerated the casualties. The Marines themselves could not be the explanation. Some Japanese officers later expressed frustration at this denial. Imperial headquarters continued to belittle the enemy on Guadalcanal and assumed that once Japanese forces landed successfully, the Marines would surrender. This stubborn refusal to learn from defeat would prove catastrophic. Instead of questioning their fundamental assumptions, Japanese commanders reached a simpler conclusion. Ikeki had sent too few men. The solution was obvious: send more. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi received command of the next attempt. He would lead approximately 6,000 men from the 35th Infantry Brigade, veterans who had fought successfully in Borneo and the Philippines. Kawaguchi was known as an unconventional thinker, a commander willing to question orders and adapt to circumstances. His soldiers respected him. Surely this force would succeed where Ikeki had failed. Kawaguchi studied the reports from the Tenaru carefully. He understood the Marines were better prepared than expected. He knew a frontal assault across open ground meant suicide. His plan was sophisticated. Instead of attacking the obvious approaches, he would march his men through the jungle to strike from the south, where the Marine perimeter was more lightly defended. A ridge running toward Henderson Field offered a natural avenue of approach. Seize that ridge in a surprise night attack, and his men could pour through and overrun the airfield before the Marines could react. The ridge had no name in September 1942. After the battle, it would be called Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge. It would become sacred ground in Marine Corps history. The approach march through the jungle proved far more difficult than Kawaguchi had anticipated. His men struggled through terrain that seemed designed to destroy military formations. Trails vanished, streams blocked routes. Dense vegetation made coordination nearly impossible. Units separated. Supplies ran out. Soldiers reached their assault positions exhausted, starving, and disorganized. Some battalions became so lost they never arrived at all. Despite these problems, Kawaguchi remained confident. Japanese fighting spirit would overcome any obstacle. The Marines would surrender once his attack achieved breakthrough. On the night of September 12, 1942, he launched his assault. Defending that ridge were approximately 800 Marines, primarily from the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. These were specialists in close combat and irregular warfare, among the best trained men in the Marine Corps. They had already seen action at Chalagi and on patrol operations around Guadalcanal. Edson was a remarkable officer. He had fought guerrillas in Nicaragua and earned a reputation as one of the most aggressive commanders in the Corps. His red hair gave him the nickname Red Mike. His men both feared and respected him. They knew he would never ask anything of them that he would not do himself. He had positioned his men carefully, with pre-registered artillery targets covering the likely approaches. He suspected an attack was coming. Japanese air raids had been hitting the ridge specifically, which suggested it was an objective. What followed was some of the most intense fighting of the entire war. The Japanese attacked in waves, screaming battle cries, hurling themselves at the Marine positions with fanatical determination. The jungle erupted. Flares turned the night into a hellscape of shadows and muzzle flashes. Hand-to-hand combat raged across the ridge as Japanese soldiers breached the lines repeatedly. At one point, the attackers came within a few hundred yards of Henderson Field itself. The outcome hung in the balance for hours. Marines were pushed back to their final defensive positions. If those positions fell, the airfield would be lost. The entire campaign would be lost. Edson was everywhere that night. Moving along the line under fire, directing counterattacks, refusing to give ground. When Marines began falling back under the weight of Japanese assaults, he stood in the open and shouted, "Raiders, this is the ridge, hold it!" Artillery fire called in by forward observers devastated the Japanese assault waves. Shells fell with deadly accuracy, breaking up formations before they could mass for decisive attacks. When ammunition ran low, Marines fought with bayonets and rifle butts. Grenades flew through the darkness. Men died screaming in languages their killers could not understand. Japanese soldiers got so close to Henderson Field that they could see the parked aircraft. American personnel began preparing to destroy the planes rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Everything the Marines had fought for seemed about to be lost. Then the attack faltered. The combination of Marine resistance, artillery fire, and sheer exhaustion had broken Kawaguchi's offensive. His men had given everything. It was not enough. By dawn on September 14th, over 600 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the ridge and in the jungle approaches. Hundreds more were wounded. The survivors retreated into the jungle, many of them already starving, to begin a nightmare march westward that would kill hundreds more from disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Vandegrift later admitted that Kawaguchi's assault was the only time during the entire campaign he had doubts about the outcome. If the Japanese had broken through, he said they would have been in serious trouble. But they had not broken through. The Marines had held. Again. Even now, after 2 devastating defeats, Japanese commanders refused to accept what the battles were telling them. They escalated their commitment while continuing to deny the obvious truth about American fighting capability. The problem was cultural. Japanese military tradition did not encourage honest reporting of failures. Officers who admitted their plans had failed risked disgrace. It was easier to blame subordinates, bad luck, or unusual circumstances than to confront the possibility that foundational assumptions were wrong. So instead of recognizing Marine capability, commanders concluded they simply needed more men, more ships, more resources. The basic approach was sound. Only the execution had been flawed. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakudake, commander of the 17th Army, arrived on Guadalcanal on October 9th to personally oversee the next offensive. He brought the 2nd Sendai Division, one of the most illustrious units in the Imperial Army, veterans of Manchuria and China. This time there would be no half measures. Over 20,000 troops would participate in a coordinated assault from multiple directions. Naval vessels would bombard Henderson Field. Air attacks would suppress American aviation. Hyakudake was so confident that his staff prepared detailed plans for accepting the American surrender. They wanted the ceremony to be the envy of every unit in the Japanese military. The date selected was October 23, 1942. Hyakudake sent a message to his superiors that captured his certainty. The time of decisive battle between Japan and the United States has come. He was right. The battle would not unfold as he expected. The October offensive began on the night of the 23rd with attacks from multiple directions. Japanese tanks advanced in darkness, engines audible before they came into view. Marines with anti-tank guns waited until the tanks were close, then opened fire. One by one, the tanks were destroyed. Japanese infantry following them were cut down. But the main attack came from the south, where the Sendai Division was supposed to achieve the decisive breakthrough. And at one section of that line, Sergeant John Basilone commanded 2 sections of heavy machine guns. Basilone was known as Manila John because he had served in the army in the Philippines before joining the Marines. 25 years old. Born in Buffalo, New York, raised in Raritan, New Jersey, the sixth of 10 children in an Italian-American family. He was acknowledged as one of the outstanding experts on the .30 caliber machine gun in the entire Marine Corps. Throughout the night of October 24th and into the 25th, his position was attacked by approximately 3,000 soldiers from the Sendai Division. What happened next would become legend. Basilone fought through the night without sleep, without food, without rest. When ammunition ran low, he fought through enemy territory to retrieve more, carrying 90 pounds of weapons and ammunition across 200 yards of ground swept by Japanese fire. When his gun crews were killed or wounded, he manned the weapons himself. When the machine guns jammed from continuous firing, he repaired them under fire, burning his hands on superheated barrels. At one point, Japanese bodies piled so high in front of his position that they blocked his field of fire. Marines had to leave their fighting holes to push corpses aside so they could continue shooting. Private First Class Nash Phillips, who lost a hand during the battle, later described Basilone visiting him at the medical tent afterward. He was barefoot. His eyes were red as fire. His face was black from gun smoke and exhaustion. His sleeves were rolled up to his shoulders. A .45 pistol was tucked into his waistband. He had just dropped by to see how the others were doing. "I will never forget him," Phillips said. "He will never be dead in my mind." By the time reinforcements arrived, only Basilone and 2 other Marines from his section were still standing. The ground before their position was carpeted with Japanese dead. Similar scenes played out across the perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Puller would become the most decorated Marine in history. That night, he was simply another officer trying to keep his men alive against overwhelming odds. His battalion held, so did the others. After the battle, Puller interrogated a Japanese prisoner. He asked a simple question: "Why did you not change tactics when you saw you were not breaking through? Why not shift to a weaker spot?" The prisoner's response revealed everything about why Japan kept failing. "That is not the Japanese way. The plan had been made. No one would have dared change it. It must go as written." This rigidity, this absolute commitment to predetermined plans regardless of circumstances, combined with continuing underestimation of American capability, proved fatal. The Japanese system did not encourage initiative at lower levels. Officers who modified plans risked disgrace. Soldiers who suggested alternatives violated the chain of command. The Americans were different. Marine officers adapted. When one approach failed, they tried another. This flexibility, combined with the stubborn refusal of individual Marines to surrender their positions, created a defensive system the Japanese could not break regardless of how many men they threw against it. The October offensive failed completely. Japanese casualties numbered between 2,200 and 3,000 dead. American casualties were fewer than 300 killed and wounded. The Sendai Division, one of the oldest and most distinguished units in the Japanese Army, had been shattered. For the first time, Japanese commanders began to seriously consider that Guadalcanal could not be retaken. As 1942 ended, the situation on the island transformed completely. What Japanese commanders had expected to recapture in days became what their soldiers bitterly called Starvation Island. A place where Japanese soldiers went to die, not from American bullets but from disease, hunger, and despair. The Tokyo Express, the nightly destroyer runs bringing reinforcements and supplies, could not deliver enough. American control of Henderson Field meant slow transport ships could not approach during daylight without being destroyed. Everything had to arrive on fast warships that could make the run and escape before dawn. It was never enough. Supplies thrown overboard from destroyers often floated away before starving soldiers could retrieve them. American air attacks sank supply ships. PT boats harassed the convoys. Each night, less reached the troops ashore. Japanese soldiers ate roots, grass, and tree bark. They suffered malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and tropical diseases their medical system could not treat. Strong warriors became walking skeletons within weeks. They developed their own grim method of measuring survival. He who can stand has 30 days left. He who can sit has 20 days. He who must urinate lying down has 3 days. He who cannot speak has 2 days. He who cannot blink will be dead by dawn. They watched helplessly as American planes flew overhead from the airfield they had been unable to capture. They saw American ships delivering supplies while their own forces starved. They knew everything their commanders had promised was a lie. On December 23rd, General Hyakutake sent a desperate message to Tokyo. No food available. We can no longer send out scouts. We cannot withstand the enemy offensive. 17th Army requests permission to break into enemy positions and die an honorable death rather than die of hunger in our dugouts. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, wrote that the situation was more serious than anything Japan had faced since the siege of Port Arthur in 1905, one of the most costly campaigns in Japanese military history. The Japanese withdrew from Guadalcanal in early February 1943. Operation KE was one of the most successful evacuations of the war. Over 3 nights, destroyers spirited approximately 10,600 survivors off the island. They left behind over 14,000 dead from combat and another 9,000 who had perished from disease and starvation. For every American killed on Guadalcanal, Japan lost nearly 10 men. Major General Kawaguchi, who had failed at Bloody Ridge and watched the campaign consume Japan's finest units, understood better than most what these losses meant. He would later call Guadalcanal the graveyard of the Japanese army. He was not exaggerating. The Sendai Division, the Ikiki Regiment, the Kawaguchi Brigade, all had been shattered against Marine defenses. Pilots and air crews lost in battles over the island were irreplaceable. Ships sunk in waters around Guadalcanal, in battles with names like Savo Island, the Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, and the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, represented a hemorrhage of naval power Japan could not sustain. But the most important loss was invisible. It was the destruction of a belief. The Marines on Guadalcanal had proven something Japanese commanders had thought impossible. Americans could fight. Americans could hold their ground. Americans could match Japanese ferocity and determination in close combat. The spiritual superiority that was supposed to guarantee Japanese victory simply did not exist. This realization spread through the Japanese military with devastating effect. In the Solomons, in New Guinea, in every subsequent campaign, commanders would face opponents who would not break, would not surrender, would not run. Japanese commanders could no longer assume aggressive night attacks would cause American lines to collapse. They could no longer count on spiritual superiority to overcome material disadvantages. They had to fight Americans as equals, and in that kind of war, American industrial production and logistical superiority would prove decisive. The Marines had not set out to disprove Japanese ideology. They were simply doing what they had been trained to do. But in holding Henderson Field against repeated assaults, they shattered one of the most dangerous assumptions in modern military history. Major General Alexander Vandegrift received the Medal of Honor for his leadership. President Roosevelt presented it at a White House ceremony in February 1943. Vandegrift would become the 18th Commandant of the Marine Corps and the first Marine to hold 4-star rank while on active duty. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, who commanded the defense of Bloody Ridge, also received the Medal of Honor. The ridge bears his name today, a permanent memorial to the 800 Marines who held it. Sergeant John Basilone, the machine gunner who held his position against 3,000 Japanese soldiers, became a national hero. When he received the Medal of Honor, he said something that captured the spirit of Guadalcanal. "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys still on Guadalcanal." He was offered a commission and a safe stateside posting. He could have spent the rest of the war selling war bonds. He turned it down. He asked to return to combat. On February 19, 1945, he was killed on the first day of the invasion of Iwo Jima while single-handedly destroying a Japanese blockhouse and guiding a tank through a minefield under fire. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, becoming the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. Someone asked him once why he was going back. He could have sat out the war in comfort. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "They're my boys, where else would I be?" He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. The 1st Marine Division, the unit that bore the brunt of Guadalcanal, was so ravaged by combat and disease it had to be withdrawn from the Pacific for months of recovery. When declared combat-ready again, it fought at Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa. The word Guadalcanal appears on its shoulder patch to this day. That patch shows a red numeral 1 on a blue diamond with the Southern Cross constellation and the word Guadalcanal beneath. Every Marine who has served in that division since 1943 has worn it, a permanent reminder of what their predecessors accomplished. Japanese military leaders had spent years preparing for war with the United States. They had studied American culture. They had assessed American capability. They concluded that Americans lacked the will to fight. They believed American democracy produced citizens who valued personal comfort over sacrifice. They believed American materialism had corrupted the fighting spirit all true warriors needed. Guadalcanal proved them catastrophically wrong. The Marines who landed in August 1942 were mostly young men in their late teens and early 20s. Many had never been away from home before enlisting. They were sick. They were hungry. They were undersupplied. They operated without naval support for weeks at a time. They held an airfield against the most elite troops the Japanese Empire could send against them. They did this not through some mysterious warrior spirit, but through discipline, training, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. They did it because they were Marines. They did it because their officers told them the ridge had to hold, and they believed it. They did it because the men next to them were counting on them not to run. They did it because that was what they had signed up for when they walked into those recruiting stations after Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto had warned of this before the war began. In the first 6 to 12 months of war with the United States, he had said, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." Guadalcanal was where that prediction came true. The 6 months were over. The run of victories had ended. What remained was a grinding, brutal war of attrition that Japan could not win. The Marines on Guadalcanal did not know they were changing history. They were simply trying to survive. They were fighting malaria and dysentery alongside the Japanese. They were living on captured rice and contaminated water. They were losing friends to enemy fire and tropical disease. But in holding that airfield, in refusing to break, they demonstrated something that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. American Marines could fight. American Marines would not quit. And Japanese commanders who had built their entire strategy on the assumption that Americans lacked fighting spirit had been proven utterly, completely wrong. Today, the battlefields of Guadalcanal are quiet. The jungle has reclaimed most of the fighting positions. Farmers sometimes find rusted helmets in their fields, dog tags buried in volcanic soil. Edson's Ridge is peaceful now, covered in grass and tropical flowers, the sound of birds replacing the screams of dying men. But the memory remains. In the Marine Corps, Guadalcanal is sacred ground. The men who fought there established the foundation for everything that came after. The reputation they built carried the Corps through the rest of that war and into every conflict since. And in Japan, though the battle is less remembered than in America, its significance is understood by those who study the war. Guadalcanal was where the tide turned. Guadalcanal was where the myth of invincibility died. Guadalcanal was where everything changed. Some of those Marines, the few who survived, still return to walk those trails, to stand where they stood 60 or 70 or 80 years ago, to remember friends who never came home. They are old now, those young men who held the ridge, fewer every year. Soon there will be none left who remember what it felt like to hear banzai screams in the darkness and choose to hold their ground anyway. But we remember. We remember Ikiki standing at the edge of that coconut grove, so confident in beliefs that were about to be proven false. We remember Vuza crawling through the jungle with 7 bayonet wounds to deliver his warning. We remember Edson shouting over the gunfire that this was the ridge and they would hold it. We remember Basilone burning his hands on a machine gun that would not be allowed to fall silent. We remember because someone has to, because these stories matter, because understanding how beliefs can blind us and courage can save us is something every generation needs to learn. The waters around Guadalcanal are calm now. The ships that sank there have become artificial reefs, home to fish and coral. Iron Bottom Sound, they call it, for all the vessels that went down in those desperate naval battles. Japanese and American sailors rest together in that dark water, enemies in life, neighbors in death. Above them, the island is green and peaceful. Children play where Marines once bled. Life goes on, as it always does. But in military academies around the world, officers still study what happened here. They study how assumptions can become fatal, how courage can overcome doctrine, how young men who had never seen combat can defeat veterans who thought themselves invincible. They study Guadalcanal, and they remember. If these stories matter to you, if you believe this history deserves to be remembered, consider subscribing to join others who share that belief. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts, from students to scholars. Every view, every share, every comment helps keep these stories alive. These men fought so that we could live in the world we have today. The least we can do is remember their names. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us keep their memory alive.